A very good afternoon or good morning, depending on which part of the world you're in. My name is Atik Anjarwala, and I'm the senior partner of Anjarwala & Khanna. On behalf of Anjarwala & Khanna, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on free trade agreements, what they mean for Kenya and Africa. I would like to acknowledge and thank His Excellency Ambassador Kyle McCarter, the US Ambassador to Kenya, and His Excellency Ambassador David Gacheru, Kenya's Deputy Chief of Mission to the United States, for taking the time to join us for this webinar today. I would also wish to thank our other speakers, Maxwell Okello, CEO, American Chamber of Commerce, and William Lay, Founding Director and Trustee of the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, for making the time to attend and enrich the conference with their undoubted experience in the areas of discussion. Furthermore, I would like to acknowledge and extend a grateful thanks to our friends at White & Case, with whom we have partnered to host this webinar and whose contribution has been instrumental. I would like to welcome Gregory Spack, Head of International Trade Practice at White & Case, Francisco de Rosenweig, Partner White & Case Mexico, and Earl Comstock, Senior Policy Counsel, White & Case. I'm also delighted to be joined by my partners at Anjarwala & Khanna, Daniel Gumi and Luisa Cetina. At the heart of our discussions today will be the subject of free trade agreements and what they mean for Africa. Free trade agreements do more for countries and regions than just eliminate tariffs. They also create a conducive environment for trade and investment by eliminating impediments to the flow of goods and services. With time, we are seeing a new breed of free trade agreements, which we consider within them trade plus issues, such as improving rules on investment, intellectual property, e-commerce, and the environment. Furthermore, FTAs provide a platform to collaborate on important social political issues, such as the enhancement of good governance and the commitment to the adherence to the rule of law. They also serve as a clarion call and a benchmark on the best practices for dealing with economic ills, such as corruption and money laundering. When two different nations come together and enter into free trade agreements, their diversity becomes the wealth of the union, as goods and services move freely where they are most needed. Today's conversation, and an important conversation, is happening against the backdrop of the Kenya-United States Free Trade Agreement negotiations. To echo the sentiments that His Excellency Ambassador Robert Lighthizer, the United States of America Trade Representative, enunciated at the launch of the Kenya-US FTA negotiations on 8 July of this year, and to quote, "Kenya is a recognized leader across the continent, an important strategic partner of the United States, and there is enormous potential for us to deepen our economic and commercial ties. This reflects the commitment of Kenya and the United States to settle on an outcome that will be economically and commercially beneficial to the two countries. Of great importance, however, is that Kenya and Africa will also join hands and give complementary effect on Africa's regional integration efforts, including the East African Community and the landmark African Continental Free Trade Area. So I now have the pleasure and the great honor of inviting His Excellency Ambassador Kyle McCarter to commence today's discussion and to share his views. Mr. Ambassador.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I think we're all getting more used to all these virtual conferences and meetings, and hopefully we're just staging everything for the time when we're somewhat back to normal and we can finalize a lot of these deals in person, face to face. At least that's my hope. And I know yours as well. But thank you to the Africa Legal Network Kenya and White and Case for organizing today's discussion. I know both of your organizations provide sound counsel to your client companies in Kenya and across the region. And today's program is of great value as we all do our part to keep the momentum building in support of the United States-Kenya Free Trade Agreement negotiations. The United States and Kenya share a deep and enduring relationship with longstanding social, economic, and political ties. Our countries have worked together to strengthen agriculture, protect wildlife and the environment, improve health, bolster education, and combat terrorism. Within our economic relationship, an FTA builds on AGOA. I like to say it will supersede AGOA, and it's a natural next step in our close partnership. Through a new free trade agreement, Kenyan and American businesses will benefit from increased access to each other's markets. Kenya's economy will become stronger and more competitive, and our consumers will enjoy more choices, lower prices, and higher quality in the marketplace. A lot of people accuse me of speaking too much about the corruption, which I call thievery, because I think it's a more, it's much better word, because corruption is a culture that we get lulled into accepting and just dealing with. Thievery is actually someone taking something of yours that's not theirs. And so you say, well, how do we deal with it? I think this is one of the ways we deal with it. I believe that agreeing to the ground rules of how we do business will provide an environment of more predictable risk. And this exponential creation of wealth will, in a way, shame the thieves. Because I always say, if a person is talented enough to steal $1 billion, they're talented enough to make $1 billion. And so I believe this is a big step in dealing with the thievery. We believe this agreement will also enhance Kenya's economic leadership on the continent and complement Africa's regional integration efforts in the East African community and the African Continental Free Trade Area. The United States pledges continued support to help the ACFTA achieve its fullest potential. As we now work to plan our third round of negotiations, which, by the way, the Kenyan leadership has asked us to continue through the holidays. And not because they don't like the holidays, but this is important to the Kenyan people. And I think every day the Kenyan leadership sees the value in what this is going to produce. And that is the motivation for us to keep our heads down and keep working on this. But as we want to conclude a comprehensive, high standard agreement that works for Kenya and the United States. Accusations come that this is about America first. It is, but it's also about Kenya first. And we expect that the agreement we come to is going to be a win-win. One that preserves Kenya's environmental protections as it improves its business environment. And that will serve as an enduring foundation to expand United States-Africa trade and investment across the continent. By promoting high standards in the United States-Kenya Free Trade Agreement, both countries will benefit from increased trade and investment. To reach a comprehensive agreement, there are many areas of focus within our negotiations. For example, the United States and Kenya will work towards one, promoting good regulatory practices to increase market access for goods and services, as well as to encourage better compatibility between the United States and Kenya regulations. Also, we want to work together to eliminate tariff and non-tariff barriers that hinder trade and to increase trade facilitation factors like efficient customs processes and trade remedies. We also want to explore opportunities that exist in sectors across our economies: agribusiness, infrastructure, healthcare, and textiles, to mention a few. These are the ones that you will find on our on our list of early harvest investments that we're looking at today. In fact, I always actually literally show the list that I carry in my diary every day, which is right now about $16 billion of possible investment. And that's really what this is all about. We can talk about it on 1,000 webinars, but we've got to make these deals. We've got to give people a good enough reason to let go of their money. And we've got to give them an environment that they're willing to take that risk, and or else they'll go somewhere else. And so, nothing matters unless you close the deals. In addition to food items and physical goods, we seek fair and open conditions for the services trade, including sectors like telecommunications and financial services. Digital trade holds enormous potential, and we look forward to working with our Kenyan partners to create a trading environment conducive to innovation and security, one where an easy digital tax is not the cure for all of the country's problems. I added that, by the way. No one told me to say that. Intellectual property protection and enforcement is critical to fostering growth and investment in the innovative and creative sectors that provide opportunities for the United States and Kenyan companies. As always, we will promote good governance, transparency, and a level playing field for our companies interested in providing solutions in Kenya. Adequate penalties and enforcement tools must also be in place to fight corruption. That's one way of looking at it. But if you're asking if any of us believe that we're going to change the legal environment in the courts overnight, we know that's not going to happen. So I think the way you deal with the corruption has to be a multifaceted approach. We will work to establish favorable conditions to attract U.S. investment into Kenya by reducing or eliminating barriers and mitigating uncertainties. Through these measures, we can improve linkages across the Kenyan economy and give United States companies new partners and new customers. Both our governments are committed to a free trade agreement that makes workers, families, and business people in both countries more prosperous. Through our free trade agreement and what I call the USA Marafiki, which is everything that the United States has to offer, and all of our agencies and all of our NGOs and all of our private sector efforts, meaning we will be the best friend that Kenya can ever look to. One that believes that they have the ability to become self-reliant. One that believes that we are committed to taking them from aid to trade, which is a much more respectful way of dealing with each other as friends. Therefore, USA Marafiki. Thank you again for convening this discussion. I appreciate all your efforts to make this a success. The United States Embassy cannot be the only one that speaks out promoting this and speaking in return to the naysayers and to those that don't want this to happen. So I ask you to join our voice together in support of this free trade agreement, and to even step up to those who want to stop it, and let us in one voice together succeed at this for the prosperity of both of our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kamau. Greatly appreciate your input, and thank you for your contribution. May I now request Greg to start his presentation, and the floor is yours, Greg, if you see what I mean.
Thank you very much, Atik. And I'd like to thank all of everybody who's responsible for organizing this. Of course, a special thanks to Ambassador McCarter and Ambassador Gachiru. It's a real honor and pleasure to have you here, and we very much appreciate those opening comments. If you'll give me 1 second, I'm just going to share now my screen so that everybody can see a presentation. And I'm going to do this in 15 minutes. We could spend 15 weeks or 15 months talking about these things. I'll try to make it as practical as possible without getting bogged down in theory, because there's plenty of theory to talk about here. But we're not going to do that. We're going to just briefly touch on it and then talk about what this opportunity is for Kenya and the United States, and then also for Africa. So whenever I talk about the free trade agreements, I like to start with this graph or something similar to it. It's a fascinating graph in my view, because it's it in a sense diagrams trade relations since World War II, and some, not everything, but some very major things. On the left side and in the blue line, you have the cumulative number of what are here called regional trade agreements, or RTAs. We'll call them FTAs here. There's a lot of different nomenclature, but we'll treat them all the same for right now. On the red line that you see falling over time is the average MFN tariff rate among the major trading countries in the world. And you can also see then a dotted line, vertical line, which shows the Uruguay round multilateral agreement, which then of course culminated with the World Trade Organization agreement that incorporated the GATT from 1947 and became as the GATT 1994. So we can make a lot of assumptions about this. You can misread the chart. You might think that it's just the FTAs that have caused the decrease in tariff levels. That would, I think, be a mistake, because remember the great achievement that the WTO, of the WTO really, and the multilateral efforts. Remember that when the GATT was signed in 1947, there were 23 members signing the original GATT. When the WTO was signed in 1994, you had 128 members, right? So you had, what the WTO really did was it incorporated the great part of the nations of the world into one multilateral agreement that agreed to tariff liberalization and liberalization of trade in general. Not all at once, some over time, but that was a tremendous impact. Now, but there's also no doubt, and today I should say, now we're up to 164 nations. We're sort of running out of nations to join the WTO, which is a good thing, I think, for the multilateral system. So, so it's easy to misinterpret this chart, but I think it's important that we all recognize that FTAs are also part of this story. They've become an important source of trade liberalization, without a doubt. And since the 1990s, as you can see in that chart, the number of FTAs has exploded. I mean, it's gone from something over, or more or less 50 to over 300. And I warn you about the counting, because you can count these all a different way. But just imagine that there's been about a 6-fold increase over the last few decades, all at the time when we have a comprehensive multilateral system that includes almost all of the world. In fact, all of those WTO members now have at least one FTA, one preferential trading agreement, right? And as of 2014, the last time somebody smarter than I did a count, they determined that the average number of FTAs per WTO member is 11. So meanwhile, while all of this activity is happening, the multilateral negotiations in the WTO have sort of bogged down, and we haven't had a comprehensive agreement since the WTO agreement in 1994. So I think it's fair to say tariffs have fallen because of both multilateral efforts and the FTAs. And the FTAs have been expanding in breadth to include not only tariffs. This is the important thing and the important point made by Ambassador McCarter. They now include a number of things which we'll see that really condition or set the conditions for a healthy trade relationship. The WTO rules, in fact, allow for FTAs, because you could ask yourself a legitimate question. We have such a great multilateral system. Why do we need these special trade agreements? Well, the agreement, the WTO agreement and the GATT before it allow for especially this. And it's a strange concept, because in a system that is built on the notion of MFN, that is most favored nation status, non-discriminatory treatment, where one member is supposed to treat everybody the same, Article 24 of the GATT and the GATT 1994, the WTO agreement, permit FTAs. They explicitly permit discriminatory treatment, and in this sense, discriminatory isn't a bad term. It means just different, I would say. And it allows participants to treat trading partners within inside the FTA differently than those outside. So what's the idea here? Why would the WTO essentially have in its text the possibility of creating an alternative universe of free trade agreements? What one person once called a spaghetti bowl of different agreements with different trade relationships among all the different members. Well, certainly the notion was that increasing economic and trade openness could eventually facilitate more trade liberalization. That was, I think, in fairness, the idea behind Article 24 and why this was baked into the multilateral system. Are they good for the multilateral system? We could debate it for hours, days, or months. Those who don't like it would say that it's a strong, that this tariff discrimination creates trade diversion that otherwise wouldn't occur if we just applied the same rules to everybody and took advantage of the multilateral system. But I think it's also very important that the argument made on the other side often is that progress on non-tariff issues, like good governance, as Ambassador McCarter mentioned, there probably wouldn't be as much progress if you were trying to negotiate those things on a comprehensive multilateral basis. So let's leave the debate aside. I said I'm going to focus on the practical, and let's do that. FTAs are here to stay. There's no question. We're not going to reverse this. I guess it's possible that someday there might be a multilateral agreement that wipes out all FTAs, but I wouldn't hold my breath. They're here to stay, and they're part of the way nations trade and build their trading relationships. Countries use them for economic and strategic reasons. They have an impact on many parts of the economy and society. A lot of critics will focus on just the changing patterns of trade for goods. That is, my goodness, if we lower our tariffs, the imports are going to come in, we're going to be wiped out. Well, but that really focuses on only one part of the story, the potential threat of a changing pattern in trade in goods. Remember, there are investment flows. Companies will invest, either companies within Kenya, within the region, from the United States, and even third countries will invest in Kenya or other trade agreement or other countries who have trade agreements with an important market like the United States, in order to take advantage of the benefits of those tariff preferences and other rules. So I would say that managed well, an FTA can bring significant benefits. One of my partners who's going to speak later, Francisco de Rosenzweig, acted as the chief negotiator for Mexico for many of its free trade negotiations, and he can speak to this issue during the Q&A session. Now, let's talk specifically about the United States. Kenya is negotiating with the United States. It's a terrific opportunity for Kenya and for the African countries. But let's recognize that for most of the 20th century, the United States was not a big fan of FTAs. And it wasn't because in fact, before World War II, it was highly critical of the United Kingdom's system of what were called imperial preferences, which were essentially the use of these specialized discriminatory trade agreements. Now, the US has used some PTAs, that is preferential trade agreements, such as the Generalized System of Preferences and later AGOA, which all of you know, but these were largely unilateral. The first FTA in the United States was Israel in the 1980s. It was 17 pages long and focused on tariff reductions. The most recent is the USMCA, which replaced NAFTA, and it was considerably longer. I'm sure everybody would not be surprised that it's no longer 17 pages, and it was considerably broader in substantive content. So as Ambassador McCarter mentioned, the scope of the US FTAs has now broadened to not only the areas covered by the WTO, but beyond that, what we call WTO plus. I'm not going to go through each of these, but you could see on the screen the sort of traditional topics covered by the WTO agreement and most modern trade agreements. And on the right side of the screen, sort of these extras that have been added over time and have made their way into some of the modern FTAs. And it sounds as though from the documents I've seen and the comments from the ambassador that certainly what the United States is seeking, and Kenya is seeking in this case, is a broad, comprehensive agreement. Now, you can ask here, we could reflect, well, why so broad? You know, why not just tariff reduction? Well, I think the ambassador mentioned that by saying that really the idea is to create an environment of more predictable risks, right? And I think that's a very elegant way to put it and an accurate way to put it. And it focuses on good regulatory practices that will allow true market access, because one of the big risks always is you have technical market access through an FTA, but you don't really have true market access if there are other problems that aren't addressed, such as the good government issues and regulatory environment. So what can you expect over the next several months? First, I'm sure you've seen it already, a range of emotions that always happens in these agreements, from fear to exuberance, from cautious optimism to predictions of doom. Most of them are overstated. I think when you get right down to it and look at the experience that other countries have had, there's a terrific opportunity, again, if managed well, to do some real good for both societies and both countries. Leadership becomes very important in shaping this outcome, and not only governmental leadership, but leadership from the private sector. The change management is going to be important because changes will occur. They're certain, and they won't be even. They'll be uneven. So, you know, I once heard one of the former secretaries of the Treasury of the United States reflecting on all the debate and concerns that were caused by the NAFTA, as saying that, you know, maybe, honestly, maybe the United States mismanaged the expectations around NAFTA and free trade agreements generally. Maybe it should have been more honest in its discussions with its own public that this is going to cause change and the changes will be uneven, and maybe we need to address those more directly. Interesting thought. It's something I think everybody ought to keep in mind in any kind of trade negotiation, whether it's regional or multilateral. And finally, I'd say others will be watching, right? Not only at the governmental level, investors in Kenya, in Africa, investors around the world who may want to, who may be hoping for this opportunity to set up, to make investments in Africa to take advantage of the favorable conditions that should be offered as a result of this agreement. And also, I'm sure you've heard by now that there will be among your other trading partners some concerns, especially those in the with whom Kenya has special trading arrangements. And I see that at least in the outline of the agreement, the parties have thought of how to deal with that issue. So there you have it. I'm done. I'd like again to thank everybody for the opportunity, and I invite you to listen and participate in the rest of this discussion because these are important issues. I'll be happy to take questions in the Q&A session along with the other panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much indeed for your very concise but very thoughtful and incisive points on a huge topic, as you said. Lots to learn, lots of challenges, but I'm sure you know, we'll manage them all. Without further ado, may I hand over the floor to Maxwell to start the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Atik, for that introduction. Thank you all, my fellow panelists. Thank you, Ambassador Makata, for making time to join us this evening. As you heard from Greg, this whole conversation around trade agreements is a really critical one. And I was looking at some statistics. Greg, you talked about over 300 FTAs that are there globally. Now, according to Statista, the EU currently has 41 trade agreements with individual countries and other free trade areas. The country with the most trade agreements after the EU is Switzerland, with 31 agreements, as well as Iceland and Norway with 30 agreements each. The US has 14 agreements, 12 being bilateral agreements, mainly with countries in Latin America and the Middle East. So clearly, this is something of significance. It's a clear trend, as Greg, you mentioned, that trade agreements are not going away anytime soon. And as Ambassador Makata said, our interest as Kenya and as East Africa, really, because the trade agreement we're talking about here is not just about Kenya, it's about the region and the rest of Africa. We're interested in seeing our countries negotiate a comprehensive and modern free trade agreement. So at this juncture, I want to bring my panelists to the floor, to the table. And how we're going to do this is I'll ask each one of them to quickly introduce themselves, say a couple of remarks regarding the topic of discussion, and then we'll dive into the conversation immediately after that. So we'll start off with Ambassador David Gasheru. Then we'll have Francisco go after him, followed by Al. We'll have Bill, and we'll finish off with Daniel. Ambassador Gasheru.
Thank you, Maxwell. Thank you, Ambassador Kamakata, for participating in this. I want to sincerely thank, it's good to be in an environment where there's support for FTAs. Well, we are used to a lot of barrage on our side, but I'm happy to mention that this question is always coming up on us and why FTA now. And I always give an example. One of the best examples I use is Vietnam. In 2000, Vietnam did bilateral with the United States. African countries did AGOA with the United States. And for the last 20 years, there's the export of textile from the United States from Vietnam at be averaging about 10 billion a year. If you look at all the African countries that Kenya were in the same GDP in the 70s and 60s. If you look at their trajectory of their growth economically, Singapore, South Korea, Philippines, Thailand. If you look at those countries' trajectory of their growth has been in double digits since they joined bilateral relationship with the United States. So I think the most important thing to understand is the foreign direct investment in the private sector from the United States has been wanting for the last 50 years. Our growth has been stagnant at 5%. So the most important thing is creating a conducive environment for business, environment investment from to Africa, and will be a shining example for other African countries. Just want to briefly move that because I know it's 2 minutes conversation, but that's my introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'll turn over to Francisco.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to today with you all. Well, I think that Mexico, it's a pretty good case about the benefits of having FTAs in place. Mexico opened up their economy back on mid 80s when we joined the GATT in 1986. And just to give you an idea, and doing echo about what Ambassador Cheru mentioned, it's very important to have appropriate environmental conditions in terms to bring foreign investment. In Mexico, just to give you an idea, back on 1990, our total foreign trade was 90 billion. Nowadays, we have a total trade over 150 billion US dollars. So as you can see, we have several times increased our foreign trade. And we have 14 FTAs in place. And Mexico bet on foreign trade because since we are neighbors to the US, we are the southern neighbors, we have been very successful negotiating FTAs. The most important one was the NAFTA back on 1994 when it was in place. And this agreement set the first time that Mexico was in a position to negotiate in similar conditions to the US and to Canada. And it allowed us to bring a lot of benefits to Mexico, not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of creating force labor that was appropriately compensated with highly skilled labor force. And also we have the possibility to create a very powerful manufacturing industry when we talk about automobiles, when we talk about auto parts, and also more importantly, when we talk about agri-good products. So I will say that even though that we have 14 FTAs in place, we have a large integration to the US. And this has brought a lot of opportunities because we also have FTAs with Europe. We have FTA with Mercosur. So we are the sole country that has a automotive FTA with Mercosur. And also we are part of the CPTPP. So as you can imagine, Mexico is a major hub, not only for trade flows, but also for investment. So we have been very successful bringing over 270 billion US dollars coming from the US out of 570 billion. So we're talking about almost half of our foreign investment is coming from the US. And this essentially comes from having appropriate business environment regulations and also being committed to free trade. No? Those will be my initial remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisco. And I just want to remind our audience that as we move along, please submit your questions in the Q&A tab, and not necessarily the chat tab. So the Q&A tab as we move along. I'll turn it over to Al. Al, briefly introduce yourself and just a few opening remarks, brief opening remarks before we get into the actual Q&A.
Sure, thank you very much, Maxwell. It's a pleasure to be here and to participate in this panel. Let me just build on a little bit what the other panelists have said, and in particular, the ambassadors. The reality is that you have an opportunity, but it's a narrow window of opportunity because the United States has a system of doing trade agreements where the Congress of the United States has to provide the authority to enter into what's called fast track systems to allow it to get approved by the US government. And right now we have a situation where our fast track authority only lasts until July of 2021. Congress may well renew that, but at the same time, it would be in Kenya's interest if you want to pursue a free trade agreement to move quickly. And I noted that Ambassador McCarter said you're going into your third round, and this is an opportunity then for you to move the ball forward and look at these trade agreements. As Greg, I think, pointed out, the U.S. has had a mixed approach to these free trade agreements. Sometimes they're supportive, sometimes they're not. But in general, I think the new administration that's coming in is going to be looking at these agreements as a positive, a way to rebuild our connections with the multilateral community, a way to expand our connections to Africa as an increasingly important area of trade. And if you think about it, Africa at 1.3 billion people is almost the size of China. So if you're an American company and you're looking to see where might I go for new markets, Africa could be very appealing, and Kenya could be a gateway to Africa, much as Francisco pointed out, Mexico is to many other areas of the Latin American and South American world for US companies. The key, of course, is, as Greg pointed out, a certain regulatory environment. So you do need to look at not just the tariff issues, but the regulatory barriers and how do you provide greater assurance to US businesses. I think one point I would make for the companies that are concerned, and I think Mexico is a great opportunity to reflect that, is US companies, when they go overseas, don't bring with them a whole workforce. They're looking for a workforce. So they're looking for an environment in which they can do business, expand their trade, manufacture, provide goods, but it's a great opportunity to build jobs. And also through increased American business presence, you'll also likely increase your tourism because Americans and others will see this as an area that is an opportunity to expand. So there are definitely opportunities for Kenya in the US free trade agreement. And I think people should be encouraged to look at that. The last point I'll make is, as Greg noted, when we do a free trade agreement, it's not just looking across trade and narrow tariff issues. It does look very much at these good government and regulatory rule of law type approaches. So the more you can do to work through those issues and get that certainty, it becomes a very important element that Congress considers when it ultimately looks at these free trade agreements and makes any necessary changes to US law. So I'll leave it at that and move on so we have a chance for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Al. I'll bring in Bill. Bill, please introduce yourself and a few opening remarks.
Okay, thanks, Maxwell. My name's Bill Lay. I enjoy Kenyan and American citizenship. I've been here, I've lived here and worked here since 1989. I came with General Motors, did a few years with them, and then I stayed in the car business with a local company called CMC. Some of you may have heard of it. I was, prior to Maxwell's time at the AmCham, when it was the American Business Association, before it became an AmCham, I was involved in that for about 20 years as well. So I've spent a lot of time in this arena. I've been a director of KAM, FKE, and was one of the founding directors of KEPSA 15 years ago. So I'm obviously, for me, this is hugely exciting. I've been working in Kenya as a manufacturer, motor vehicles and I've lived through the East African community changes between Tanzania and Uganda and all those. And some of us who've also been here in this environment appreciate the fact that we have so much talent and so many natural resources in this country. And I plan to spend the rest of my life here. I'm a farmer now in Taita Taveta. I do seed potatoes, so I've kind of retired from the car business. But I'm involved with Maxwell and a few others on this consortium for the free trade agreement. A lot of issues have been raised. A lot of text is being written this week in preparation for these, I think, as I understood, round 3. But my American ambassador, who spoke before everybody, I could have written that speech. I agree with everything he said about the fact that this thing can also be can help us with corruption, because Foreign Corrupt Practices Act doesn't have a lot of wiggle room for those kind of things. But for me, and the bottom line, and you'll hear me talk about it later, is this thing is about communications. And like the ambassador said, the US Embassy can't be the only. And I heard Ambassador David also mention that there are a lot of naysayers out there. And those guys need to be converted, because those guys have a negative attitude, because what we're proposing is going to upset what they have. And those guys are always difficult to deal with. But those of us who've lived here a while, and with all the professional help we have from both sides, I'm sure that we're going to succeed. The last point I'd make is that, and I've mentioned this to our group before, we're very fortunate to have Betty Mina in her job as the Cabinet Secretary for Trade, because she spent her entire life in Kenya at Kenya Association of Manufacturers in the private sector. So she understands all these issues intimately. And to the extent we can provide good input to her and Ambassador Weru and the rest, which is important from the private sector standpoint, then I believe we'll be able to push this thing and maybe make some serious progress before the window closes on the current agreement in July, as was just mentioned earlier. So I'm happy to be here and answer any questions that people have, but I'm very high on Kenya. I'm very high on America, and I feel like we've been invited to a dance that very few people were considered for. And I think we need to dress ourselves up, learn how to dance, pull up our socks, and become, very professional players in the international trade business. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill. We're certainly dressing up, and we're certainly going to be dancing on this one. Daniel, kindly introduce yourself. If you could please keep your remarks brief.
Thank you, Maxwell. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Daniel Ngomi. I'm a partner with Anjawala and Kana. And very excited about talking to you this afternoon with respect to the free trade agreement. Very exciting times for Kenya. It's been mentioned, and we are going to be talking about the US-Kenya free trade agreement. Fairly recently, on the 3rd of November, the UK and Kenya also signed a free trade agreement. So it sounds and it looks like they are very exciting times for the country as a whole. Obviously, trade agreements are not new to Kenya. Kenya has been part of the East African community. It was part of the PTA, Preferential Trade Area, which subsequently became COMESA. It's a member or has joined up to the Africa Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Area. So all these are times when we will see lots and lots of changes in our generation. Drawing from the comments that have been said by Ambassador Gashero, also the comments by Ambassador Kyle Makata, in reality, Kenya stands to gain significantly from all these various trade agreements, in particular the level of investment and the level of employment levels in this country. So really looking forward to a very interesting conversation this afternoon as we talk about the various issues that will emanate from the Kenya-US Free Trade Agreement. Thank you, Maxwell.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And then thank you, panelists, for your opening remarks and your introductions. I want to get this show on the road. And I want to invite my good friend, Ambassador Gasheru. There's quite a bit of talk around this FTA. And, Bill did mention that him and I sit as part of a private sector consortium that's trying to bring perspective from a private sector view or a standpoint into government's, what would I call it? Their preparation to be able to effectively negotiate this trade agreement. Now, one of the things that keeps coming up, one of the questions that keeps coming up is why this FTA? Why don't we just push, for example, the renewal of AGOA? What is it that GOK is seeing with the FTA, and what potential impacts would you say would accrue for Kenya through this FTA?
That's a very good question. If you look for the last 50 years, for Kenya, and not for Kenya, in African countries, private sector investment in Africa has been wanting. If you look at foreign aid, PEPFAR, and all those things that the American government has provided, it has been there. I always give an analogy of the AGOA issue on Vietnam. And I give that example because I want to give you perspective. In 2000, Africa signed AGOA. But Vietnam did bilateral with the United States. If you look at the foreign direct investment into Vietnam, because of that, the foreign direct and biggest investor in Vietnam, ironically, was China. They have been averaging about $25 billion of textiles to the United States. That's one example. And the example is that creating a conducive business environment. Those business environment are the barriers to trade that we all know about. that has been a problem for us. Africa in total, textile export to the United States doesn't go beyond $500 million a year. $500 million a year. Vietnam on its own, until the last 3-5 years, right now is average about $9 billion a year of textile to the United States. Why? It's because of conducive environment for business and investment and the private sector. So the fundamental thing here to realize is that we have to create level playing field for the businesses to say, I want to invest in Kenya. I want to come to Kenya and invest. And the issue of there's always this fear of that they're going to overwhelm us with milk and all that. Investment can also be, and I think Nani Fernandez mentioned that on investment inflows, where they can come in, and we have a very good example right now of pyrethrum regrowing this country. We have American companies that have come here, actually have revived the growing of pyrethrum. They have invested, and they're reviving the growth pyrethrum as a cash crop for the country. That has been there. So the question is why? The other factor that we also need to understand is that we are growing at a different rate in Africa. So one country is lower middle income country, the other one is LDC countries. So when you are dealing with a relationship among those countries, they are in different growth areas. If you look at our financials, our financial and foreign exchange in Kenya, it's far more superior than any other country in Africa. Kenya is the only country you can put $50,000 investment tomorrow, and the following day you can withdraw that money. You can't do that in most countries, even the most developed economies in Africa. So there are a lot of things that are important for us that we can set as a template for other African countries to go in. So the question for me is mainly on foreign direct investment. And for the market access issue, we have very minimal trade in the United States as far as goods and services are there. They're very minimal. I would worry if Americans grow coffee, if Americans grow tea, if Americans grow flowers, if Americans grow pyrethrum. I worry about that. But I think I will look at the potentials of investors coming and changing our milk. Somebody come investing in building farmers, putting together feeder lots in Kenya to create beef. And the market for the beef and milk is right in Sub-Saharan Africa. As someone mentioned, we have $1.7 billion people. We have 750,000 youth in Africa. 3/4 of the world workforce in the next 30, 40 years will come from Africa. How we manage that youth population is a function of our stability as a country. Any country in Sub-Saharan Africa. So we have to create investment flow into our country to increase our middle class and to increase our services. So some of these foreign direct investment from the United States actually are not taking out any product out of Africa. They're just taking their profit. So if a company can come and build a highway from Nairobi all the way to Yandu and create infrastructure. Look at the trade facilitation problems we have now in East Africa. If you go to Malaba now, we have a 20, 30, 40-mile backup of trucks. There are a lot of trade facilitation investments that can be done with an FTA, where we have maybe multiple highways into Uganda. We can have multiple highways in Tanzania. That's building infrastructure among ourselves. Because if we can bring investors to help us build infrastructure that help us communicate among ourselves, all we have to do is just increase our internal, help us, African countries, to trade better. We have no infrastructure.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. So it's really about creating an environment that is stable, that is predictable. It's about the opportunities that exist, not only in Kenya, but in the region, to help grow and advance economic development. You've talked about the agriculture space. I think you've touched on that a little. And I just want to bring Francisco into the conversation. Just picking up the cue from what you've said, Mexico has 14 trade agreements. You know, the million-dollar question would be, why so many trade agreements? And if you could share with us what the impact of that has been, especially on some of these, I would say, sensitive industries. or sectors. So if you look at agriculture, if you look at manufacturing, those tend to be the real sensitive areas when it comes to trade agreements. What is Mexico's story, and what sort of insights can we glean from that?
Sure, Maxwell. Well, thank you for the question. Is very good question. Since when Mexico decided to open up their economy, the Mexican agri-good industry was fully opposed to any free trade agreement negotiation with the U.S. And that was due to the main reason that we thought that we had a lack of competitiveness. So the agriculture industry, the farmers, growers were opposed. But as the years passed by, this is a successful story because they learn how to create and to identify some areas of opportunity and some products where Mexico has been very competitive. And I'm not talking only about avocados. As you know, we are the leading exporter of avocados, but also we are very successful in some other products such as berries, tomatoes, citrus, and papaya, and I would say a basket of around 60 agri-goods where we are highly competitive, and we are exporting only about 14 billion US dollars, talking about 60 products. So I will say that the story is a very interesting story, because the farmers and ranchers shift their view to FTAs. And this is something that, just to give you an idea, we were net importers in terms of a lot of agri-goods coming from the US or from other regions of the world. And nowadays we have a superávit. So I will say that if you see, as it happened in the US also while we were renegotiating the NAFTA or the USMCA, one of the core areas and populations that were supporting the FTAs or the USMCA was the farmers and ranchers, because they saw an opportunity for their families and for their business. So I will say that the challenge here, I will say that, is how to identify those goods that you can produce in a competitive way. And second, how you can see free trade as a complementary approach. So we cannot be self-supply, we cannot have everything that is produced in Mexico or in the US or in Kenya and believe that we don't need imports. So the main successful story of Mexico, at least, is that we are complementary. Just to give you an idea, we are maybe the most important destination from the US for grains, no? So we have a very balanced trade in terms of agri-goods, even though that we have a slight superávit. And over the years, I will say that when we talk about economies such as the most important ones in the Asia region, our main exports are related to agri-goods. We're not talking about manufacturers. What we're doing is importing manufacturers, intermediate goods, but we are exporting agri-goods. So I will say that this is something that I will never expect to see over the years, because I will say that this shift came like 10 years after we had the NAFTA agreement in place. So I will say that it was about 15 years ago when we have a very strong and successful story about having our rancher and farmers supporting FTA. So I think that is something that can be replicated in many jurisdictions, as in Kenya. And it's about just to identify those opportunities and the areas where any country needs to have a complementarity approach.
All right, thank you for that. Bill, you represent the private sector on this panel. And I just want to take the cue from what Francisco has talked about in terms of identifying complementarity, comparative advantage. What would your view be in terms of key priorities, speaking from a Kenyan private sector perspective, given where you sit and then some of the engagements that we've had? what would you say are some of the key priorities from a private sector, Kenyan private sector perspective on this potential US-Kenya FTA?
Okay, by far the most important is going to be competitiveness. If we're going to, or as we link ourselves up with this FTA, and as we also attract partners from sub-Saharan Africa to be part of those engagements, and you've heard me say it before, competitiveness is, we like the things we make in Kenya, but probably we're not, except for maybe a few products, most of the products that we would like to export here, we could improve the quality. So I think improving the quality and competitiveness, you know, making sure our cost base is realistic. So competitiveness would be my first priority. My second priority would be to, as I mentioned earlier, the way we do business, the way we do our accounting, the way we pay our taxes, our compliance with, you know, globally accepted standards for doing business. We also need to, you know, improve our business practices. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act will be something that will require a bit of a learning curve for a lot of local companies, whether they're here in Kenya or in East Africa or wherever. So from a private sector standpoint, I think I represent a lot of people who believe that we've got, like I said, so much potential. We've only been able to manage to be competitive within our East African community, say, with the exception of some exports to the States for flowers and crafts, textiles, and those few items we did under AGOA. But the private sector believes that this agreement will improve our competitiveness. It'll address, like the ambassador said, some of the corruption issues. It'll put people in a position where they can understand what it takes to do business in partnership with America. And then, you know, at the end of the day, the quicker we get it done, the better, because these kind of things, you grow slowly, and then you know, form a good basis, and we could be the global supplier of so many things without going into the details of each of them. But our concerns would be that let's get something we can count on. Let's get some stability. There's always the political thing, and there's always getting used to what we've done with China for the last few years. There's a lot of things to not undo, but to either replace. You know, when I came here, it was import substitution was what we did for local assembly. Now it's going to have to be substituting somebody else's imports for products from under the FTA. So I think it's going to be a lot of work, but everybody's down for it. Let me tell you, everybody's waiting to see. This could be the opportunity that we've been waiting for, and we just need to be prepared to maybe do things a bit differently than we've done them in the past.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill. Al, you did mention in your remarks some significant political and legislative considerations from a process perspective when it comes to how the US engages in an FTA. What, in your view, assuming we're able to overcome some of these practical issues, what in your view would determine whether or not this particular FTA would become a success?
Well, I think, thanks very much for that question. And I think while the authority expires right now in July, at the beginning of July of 2021 for what's called the Overall Trade Promotion Authority, the US can still do individual FTAs. So if this process continues or is completed before that deadline, I think there will be a lot of interest in Congress potentially in seeing this adopted. And if you're successful in addressing the other issues, the things that will lead to investment, like improving the business practices, agreeing to certain environmental conditions, and other things that are important across the Congress, especially the Democratic side of the Congress, I think you will see a lot of support, largely because of the geopolitical situation increasingly with China. As this becomes a little bit more of a competition between the US and China over where things are done, and particularly if US investment is leaving China, you're going to be finding people looking for homes and looking for places. As I said,
That's
Africa is
exactly
1.3
right.
billion people, roughly the size of China. So if there's going to be growth for American companies, it will be through investment in places like China. You'll also see investments in Southeast Asia and other locations, but there's a real opportunity here. And I think if there's a positive agreement, regardless of the change in administration, there will be strategic reasons why the United States will see an agreement with Kenya, especially if it's an agreement that fits into the larger African trade agreement that you've got. That will be very beneficial and will be looked on favorably by Congress. So the real challenge in the US system is if you don't have the Senate and the House, our two bodies of Congress, agreeing to sort of fast track rules, getting an agreement through and approved if it requires changes in US law can be difficult. That said, I think a lot of the US laws are already in place. So there's a fair amount of room for an agreement to be reached without significant change to US law. And so that improves their possibilities, even if you have to go as a standalone agreement.
All right, thanks, Al. Daniel, what's your perspective from a Kenyan point of view when it comes to the legislative process for an FTA? Could you please just share what that would look like and maybe even some possible timelines from your perspective?
Thank you, Maxwell. So I think the free trade agreement is, from a Kenyan perspective, will be seen as a treaty. And in Kenya, treaties form part of Kenyan law under the provisions of the Constitution. In addition, we have the Treaty Making Act, which basically outlines the process in terms of how this is done. Now, at the moment, there's a lot of negotiations that are going on. When the treaty is ready, it will be laid before the cabinet. The cabinet will consider the issues that are set out, and then it will be laid out. It's required to be laid before the parliament. Now, the way it works is that it doesn't need to be laid through before the parliament as a whole. It can be laid before the specific committee of the parliament. But one of the really interesting things is that under Kenyan law, increasingly, there is a requirement for public participation. And public participation is now a constitutional threshold, which is increasingly causing certain treaties to be knocked out. For example, the Kenya-Mauritius DTA, double tax treaty, was knocked off for lack of public participation not so long ago. So therefore, the process that is currently ongoing, where you find that, for example, KEPSA, we have Kenya National Chamber of Commerce, and other sectors in the private sector plugging in, getting involved in the process of negotiating the free trade agreement becomes really, really important and critical in getting towards a pathway of reaching a place where you can say that there was a lot of private sector involvement and public participation from that sense. I think it's been said before that there hasn't been enough sort of attention by private sector in terms of negotiating the treaty and giving input to it. There are lots and lots of real benefits that will come to the country as a whole. And the more that there is participation from interested sectors, be it law firms, be it accounting firms, be it the case that you'll be hearing from farmers and textiles manufacturers as well as general manufacturers, becomes extremely important. And in fact, is a constitutional threshold from a Kenyan perspective. Thank you, Maxwell.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I want to start fielding some questions from the audience. We are already running out of time, would you believe it? There's a question here addressed to Ambassador. And Ambassador, thank you for staying on with us. It's really touching on timelines. And the question is from Waniki, who's asking, who's saying actually that we find the FTA negotiations can take a significantly long period of time, from a couple of months to even years. As is in the case of the Kenya-US FTA, what timelines realistically, from where you sit, would you say this would look like?
Well, I think, you can listen to a lot of people on this, and some can tell you a year or 2 years. They can, we know what would be ideal, and that would be to meet the fast track, dates that are in front of us. I'm encouraged again by the Kenyan leadership to say that they wanted to work this all the way through the holidays. I think there's motivation from President Kenyatta to get this done. I'll say that I heard the same thing from both presidents. I heard from President Trump and President Kenyatta look over and say to Lighthouser and and can you get this done? Get this done. And so I think there's real motivation to get it done. So if we can hit, if we do it, I think we can, but we can't take too many breaks. We can't get tied up on too many small issues. We're going to have to get past used clothing and some things like that and just and go forward. So I think it's possible to do it in this accelerated timeline. I hope it is, because I just think that, I'm working on this side. You say there's a need for public participation. I have had, I think I've had 6 of the parliamentary committees to my house to speak to every one of them about the FTA and how it can benefit their constituencies, and how I want them to be involved in the process now and not to lay this on them and let them try to figure it out later. So they are giving me input here and early on. And so I think people are going to have to invest in this conversation seriously and early on if we're going to meet those, those early dates.
Thank you, Ambassador. For you, Daniel, the question from Azim Vaji, and the question is, how do these FTAs compare with the EAC COMASA agreements?
Thank you, Maxwell. I think one of the things that's really interesting about the EAC COMASA issues versus the FTA is that there are a lot of similarities in actual sense. First of all, East Africa has a common external tariff. It's a common customs union, and therefore all the goods that come into the region have a set tariff that applies with respect to goods that come into the country. Now, what the FTA aspires to do is that it aspires to reduce the tariffs that will be applying on goods and services flowing either side. So goods that are coming from Kenya going to the US, goods that are coming from the US coming to Kenya, services that are being traded as between the two countries. And in reality, a lot of the current customs and excise duties that apply are sought to be eliminated. But more than that, what the FTA does is that it talks about a number of items that will be discussed. Today, we have talked about transparency issues. That's a key facet that is under the FTA. Today, we have touched on issues to do with digital services. That's an aspect that is under the FTAs. We have talked about issues to do with intellectual property. So it's a whole holistic arrangement that will allow various sectors, various groups to each be dealt with in specific form and shape under the DTA. And each of the two countries is negotiating on each one of these points. So in reality, there are some similarities, although what the FTA does is that it broadens the number of issues that for all intents and purposes will be negotiated for the best outcome of both countries as far as the trade negotiations go.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. There's a question here from Yusuf Kamara. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And he's asking, what do you expect the future of US trade policy towards Africa to favor? Sorry, do you expect the future of US trade policy towards Africa to favor bilateral agreements, or to seek to expand AGOA? And this I'd like to give to both Al and Greg. If you could please comment briefly on this.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. Look, I don't think it's going to matter what the what administration is in for the reasons that Ambassador McCarter mentioned. This makes a lot of sense from a U.S. policy perspective and also for geopolitical and strategic reasons for the United States. And look at it this way: if you have a unilateral preferential system right now in AGOA, from the United States perspective, why wouldn't you want something more comprehensive that would also allow for this creation of conditions that can help your business community? So from the US perspective, why would you not want to go from a preferential unilateral type tariff agreement to a more comprehensive one that sets the conditions for growth and stability and additional benefits for both sides? Earl?
Yeah, and I would just add that since extending AGOA would take an act of Congress as well, you're faced with many of the same debates and challenges. And so I think it's in Kenya's interest, and it's in the United States' interest to look at this in the larger perspective. If you can increase investment, you're going to increase the wealth of Kenya, which will help reduce terrorism. It will also create a more favorable tourist environment. When you have U.S. businesses present in a country, it makes U.S. and other nationals feel more comfortable about going there. It signals an improved security situation, and it creates greater players and greater wealth in that area. So you're going to find, I think, many of the same conversations that would go into renewing AGOA as a form of aid to parts of Africa go into the discussion of a free trade agreement. So if you can move along quickly, as Ambassador McCarter is saying, you really have a window of opportunity here to potentially get something approved before the authority expires. But even if it doesn't, and the authority expires, there's an opportunity, if you do a good deal, to carry this forward and get something approved that would benefit both countries.
Thank you, Al. One final question from it's Yusuf Komara as well. It's very specific. He's asking, what impact can we expect? He's talking about the continental free trade, continental trade area, continental Africa free trade continental area. And his question is what impact that is bound to have on power generation and trade in East Africa. So we can locate this within the broader conversation around trade agreements and potential impacts in a specific sector, such as the energy sector. Gregory, you want to give that a shot?
Sure, let me start. It's a great question because, from the outside looking in, sometimes you see all these different acronyms, and you see, as the prior question or 2 questions ago mentioned, what's the difference between the ECA and the U.S. Kenya agreement and then COMESA and the African? Well, remember, they're all sort of the same thing in the sense that they're all authorized under Article 24 of the GATT and the WTO agreement with the purpose of increasing integration, right, on a regional or other basis. The idea is the more countries who get together and agree on standards such as that will promote liberalized trade, the easier it is to move the whole world towards a more liberalized trading system. That's the idea. So, I think it's in, and remember, a lot of people don't remember that we had sort of the similar system going forward in the United States under the first President Bush, where we were talking about a free trade agreement of the Americas, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego was the famous saying at the time. And now we lost, and a whole decade of people throughout the United States in the Western Hemisphere dedicated their lives to kind of, their professional lives at least, to helping that come into. It fell apart, but there were, you had the same sort of system. Take these individual agreements, get like-minded countries through the bilateral and regional agreements, put them together in a bigger one. Maybe that would help then on the multilateral level tackle the more difficult issues that currently can't be done. So it's great to see this happening, I think, in Africa. I think it's a great idea. There's always the difficulty that if you launch something too ambitious, as arguably some of the ones that were launched in the 80s and 90s without sort of a purpose, they linger on and people lose faith in the integration process. Here you've got a possibility with different countries taking different approaches. Everything can be sort of pulled together and contribute to the kind of standard setting and liberalization that we all think is a good idea.
All right, thank you, Greg. We've run out of time. I want to give each one of our panelists just 30 seconds to give your closing remarks before I hand over back to Atik. We'll start off with you, Ambassador Gachel.
Thank you very much, Maxwell and Atik and the team, and Ambassador Kamakata for the opportunity to. This is part of public participation. I think it's very important to engage and sensitize the private sector. I think there is a potential for, one question was asked, how can the private sector, especially the legal fraternity, there's a lot of opportunities in capacity buildings in those areas that we need to bring up to American standards. I think there's a big opportunity where the private sector, especially the legal teams, can help in this process by building those standards for our country, where we need to come up to standard United States standards, especially in the legal intellectual properties, capacity on agricultural, certified sanitaries. So there are areas that we feel that on the private sector is potential for the public participation of the legal fraternity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Al?
Great, thank you. And it's been a pleasure to be here. And I would just close with saying you have an opportunity here on a bilateral basis to focus on the benefits of investment and attracting U.S. capital to a critical part of Africa. So we wish you luck, and obviously anything we can do to be helpful, please let us know.
Daniel?
Thank you very much. It's been really good talking to all of you. I think, one of the questions that was raised, and I'll say it by way of closing remarks, what will the free trade areas do for us? What's been said with respect to the Africa Free Trade Area is that countries will reduce tariffs as between each other by 90%. Trade is supposed to grow by 52% as between African countries by the year 2022. You can imagine what this will do with respect to the Kenya-US trade under the FTA, as well as all the other FTAs that Kenya is entering into. So in reality, what the free trade areas will do is that they will break barriers, reduce tariffs, make it easier for goods to flow freely between countries within this region. And Kenya is very much in the middle of it all, in the sense that it is the epicenter of East Africa and will tap into the region as a whole, and particularly across the whole African continent, if we get it right with respect to the US Free Trade Agreement, as well as the UK. So in many respects, we are the pace setters, and I think we are very encouraged by the opportunity that Kenya currently faces and has. And we certainly hope that as a country, we will make the most of it and move forward to a better and brighter future for Kenya.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Bill, briefly.
Okay, well, mine is really simple. Anybody who's on this webinar, anybody who knows anybody that's on this webinar, it's time to spread the word. It's time to put your money where your mouth is. It's time to engage and stop sitting on the sidelines and complaining about things. Let's all get out there, be positive. Imagine what Kenya will look like 10 years from now when we've done this thing. And everybody's lives are better. We got the expressways, we got the airports, we got the hotels, we've got miniature trains running from place to place in Nairobi now. So we're just on the verge, and let's look past this COVID thing, which is going to go away eventually, and look for a brighter future. Anybody who wants to get involved that's not a member of KEPSA, they just need to contact KEPSA or AmCham or any of the organizations to sign up and help us win this battle. So thanks for the opportunity, you guys. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Francisco, I'll give Ambassador Makata the last word. Francisco, then Gregory. Very briefly, please.
Thank you. Well, I will say that keep the momentum, improve, if possible, the domestic legal framework, and as we mentioned, many of us, it's very important to have a predictable business environment, and this is through having appropriate regulations. So all the luck, and I just can say that we negotiated already twice with the US, and it's worth it. Thank you.
Now, I would just close by saying that I hope that the process is constructive in Kenya, not destructive, because process is important. There will be some legitimate concerns. Deal with them directly. You can convince people, and you can change minds, and that's ultimately much better for the process if you can build some consensus to what should be a good opportunity for Kenya and the United States.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Makata, any closing remarks from you?
Yeah, real quick. I just want to say that if we do this, if we do it right, we can show the rest of Africa how to do it right. And I think, you know, there was a reason Kenya was chosen for this. And there's reasons many of the neighbors weren't chosen. But Kenya has the opportunity to lead and show the rest of Africa how to do it right and how to really benefit the people of the country and both of our countries. And the last thing I'll say is, if I wasn't in this position, I'd be one of the first investors. And so I'm not saying what I'm saying just because it's my job and because I'd like to finish a small a small project. This is a big project, but if I wasn't in this position today, I'd be one of the investors. So I encourage everybody to help us get this across the finish line for the good of all of the Wananchi.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Completely agree. And for me personally, and on behalf of AmCham, I just want to say, as Kenyans, we know we have several naysayers in this agreement. Let us not get caught in the trap of the present. This is about the future. The youth dividend that we have as Kenya, we need to be able to create for them jobs. We need to be able to create prosperity. The movement from, or the shift from aid to trade, the journey to self-reliance that you talk about so passionately, Ambassador, that is what we long for. And I think at the end of the day, we have an opportunity here. This is an excellent tool with which we can ground and really create that takeoff point for the country so that we are able to realize the transformative agenda that I believe we all want, not just for us, but for our children and our children's future. So I want to thank you all very much. Thank you, A&K, for the partnership. Thank you, my wonderful panelists, for your insights. And at this juncture, I want to turn it over back to Atik to close the forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. A really amazing and a fantastic panel. Maxwell, thank you. Lots and lots of things to think about, lots of things to do. I'm certainly very excited after this, after hearing the panelists and the speakers. And my partner Louisa is going to make some final comments. And before I hand over to her, I'm a big believer that let economics drive politics and not politics drive economics. And I think this is what the FTAs do. It makes for better politics as well. So without further ado, let me hand over to Louisa and also thank each and every one of you, especially our colleagues at White and Case, for all the help they've given. Louisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Atik. Thank you. Yeah, we're very honored to have had this very prestigious panel. So on behalf of A&K, I would like to extend our gratitude to all those who joined us today for this webinar. We know it's late here, it's early in the US. Particularly, I would like to thank the Ambassador, the Excellency, the Ambassador Cal McCarter, and His Excellency, the Ambassador David Gashero. Additionally, I would like to thank the rest of our guest speakers who have taken their time to share with us their wealth of knowledge in the area of international trade. They include our wonderful moderator, Maxwell Okello, Bill Lay, who has been very helpful with his straight talk, the entire White and Case team, Greg Spack, Earl Comstock, and Francisco de Rosenzweig. We really hope that you found today's conversation fruitful, informative. We live at also exciting times, and hopefully times of new beginnings. So we're optimistic that the Kenya-US FTA negotiations will act as a catalyst for a new era of bilateral relations, and that the FTA will prove effective as a basis of future engagements, not just for Kenya, but also between the US and other African countries, as we have discussed today. It is clear that the rest of the region, as Greg mentioned, is going to be watching. Other international players will be as well. They will be paying close attention to the role that the Kenya-US FTA will play in African regional integration. As Dan mentioned, and as Mr. Vergi raised in his question, there's the interplay with the East African community, and with the African Continental Free Trade Area, particularly given that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is set to be operationalized, hopefully in January of this coming year. While work, of course, remains to be done in bringing the FTA to life, if successful, it will enrich our respective countries' historical ties, and we hope that it will create a conducive environment for trade and for investment flow between the nations. And we hope that it will foster the rule of law. Given the significance of the negotiations, as has been repeatedly stated in this session, we do encourage all the key stakeholders in Kenya to please engage in the consultative process led by KEPSA, by government, by the consortium that Bill mentioned, and others in the lead up to the FTA. It is truly crucial that you actively participate in these conversations now. Given the significant movements within the continent's trade and investment environment, given Kenya's role, given ANK's positioning within the legal community, we're very, very excited to announce that we are actually launching a standalone international trade law practice. The new practice will focus on all areas relevant to international trade, including tariffs, commerce and investment, dispute resolution, which is my area, anti-corruption, transparency, rule of law issues, both in the context of regional as well as international trade, to name a few areas. We're therefore honored to be part of these key discussions at the very genesis of this time, and we look forward to playing a part in facilitating trade and better investment in Africa through this new practice. Thank you very much, and goodbye.